And our next speaker is also a dear friend and somebody who's joining us not for the first time, David Hutchens. He was really willing to join us, but he has an event today. But he was so willing that he left us a recording, and you will be hearing a small talk from David on how to invite a story. Because small data, for example, is great when you are attentive. But how do you create an environment where people want to share their story? We have several speakers talking about this immensely important point on our conference, and let's just have a look at what David has to offer. Enjoy.
Hey friends, David Hutchens here, CEO of Mythos Global, home of the storytelling leader. Thank you, Artem, for having me. I have enjoyed our friendship and our collaboration over the past several years, starting before COVID. And today I want to share some ideas that I've been playing with recently. And I just came back from the Netherlands. So I live in the United States. I'm here in Nashville, Tennessee of the United States. And last week I was in Utrecht in the Netherlands working with a group of banking leaders and banking innovation, financial innovation leaders across the Netherlands. And so we're building this capability of story engagement. And we spent an entire week together. It was rich and it was powerful. And we talked about the idea of, we keep using this word storytelling. I don't love the word telling. It's kind of, storytelling is kind of a weird word, right? And it's right there in the word telling. It sounds like a transaction that goes one direction. And one of the things we talked about is the power of inviting a story. Because your teams, if you're a leader with teams, your teams have stories that you haven't heard, because we don't create occasions for those stories to come forward. Your customers and partners have stories that you haven't heard yet. And when we bring those stories forward, it can be very powerful. So we talked about how do we invite the stories. And I've worked with other clients who, after we tell stories together, they send me emails later. And one lady said, "Hey, David, I tried what you said. I asked my team to tell stories and it didn't work." Sometimes I hear that. And yeah, it's interesting because when we tell stories, when we use this language, that story, we're already doing this all the time. When you went out for dinner or drinks with your friends in the past week, you started telling stories. No one had to tell you to do this. And yet when we bring it inside the organization, something happens where it stops. So how do we invite a story? I want to share with you just some simple ideas about how to bring stories forward that we could be telling. And so when I work with teams, it looks kind of like this, right? And those of you who do story work will recognize this structure. This is the classic story circle. And Artem and I and others who do this work really have this wonderful gift that we get to host these wonderful conversations, right? Notice how we're sitting in a circle. You can see the engagement. You can see the facial expressions. There's a lot of emotion cues in this. So how do we create this? Story is sensitive to language. So let me give you a test. So recently I worked with a group here in Nashville, Tennessee, a client of mine. It's a wonderful organization, Thistle Farms. They help women come out of prostitution and sex trafficking, and they create marketplace skills and leadership. And now it's a $10 million organization where they create body products and lotions and soaps and candles. $10 million organization. So I support this organization. I'm on their board. And we wanted to identify the organization's values, right? Every organization has a statement of values, right? Excellence and quality and all that stuff. And the traditional thing is for leaders to go out on a retreat and come back and say, all right, we've identified the values. And we didn't want to do that. We didn't want the leaders to say, here's what we think the values are. We wanted to uncover the actual values. and have the employees, the survivor leadership community say, here's what our values are. So here's my test question for those of you who are listening. How would you elicit those values? How would you get the employees to share what the values are? A traditional way, what a lot of people would do is, bring everybody together in a conference room and get the groups and say, tell us what the values are. What do you think our values are? That doesn't work very well. They'll say things like quality and, all the stuff we just said, right? No, we want stories, because when people tell stories, then we can have the sense-making conversation and say, I heard something about our values in those stories. That's the outcome we wanted. So how would you ask for that story? I'll show you the prompt that we used. So we brought everybody together, sat in circles, kind of like this. And here's what we said. Tell me about a time a leader inspired you with their values by doing the right thing, even though it might have come with a cost. And the idea is that with language like this, now we're going to get different kinds of information. We're going to get stories. And stories have people in them, and stories have that emotion content, and stories are rich. We can do the sense making, and now it's not just these words like quality and excellence. Now it's lived experience where we can credibly say, this truly is who we are. So you may have noticed that, or maybe you didn't notice that, I'm doing some specific things when I use a prompt like this. Tell me about a time a leader inspired you with their values by doing the right thing, even though it might have come with a cost. The first thing I'll call your attention to is this language up at the front, right? If you do story work, you may already know about this. Tell me about a time. So again, we don't want to say, what do you think our values are? That'll get you some, maybe a thoughtful conversation, but you'll get a list. But when you say, tell me about a time, we're inviting people to reflect on their memories. Tell me about a time. Now your brain has been invited to look at the timeline of your experiences. A time when something happened, right? That story language. There's another thing that you may have noticed that I do here. Very often when I ask for stories, sometimes my clients notice this. They say, you use a lot of emotion words, right? So I didn't just say, tell me about a time we lived our values. Tell me about a time you felt inspired by our values. And this is important. Often when I ask for stories, I try to put in an emotion word in there, right? Tell me about a time you served a customer in a way that was really exciting. The reason this is powerful is, again, we're searching our memory for stories. When I say an emotion word, time you were inspired. Well, you know what it feels like to be inspired, right? You've been inspired before. And so when I say inspired, you summon that feeling up in your body. And now as you're going through the stories that live in your brain, in your head, in your brain, we're doing it through this lens. Inspired. Now, when we tell a story, we're going to get a different kind of story. If you just say, tell me about a time that the values made a difference in our business, someone might say, oh, well, one time we stuck to our value for quality and we saved $10,000, right? You'll get a different kind of a story. But if you say a time you were inspired, oh, that's different, right? So very often to get these deeply human stories, I like to drop that emotion word in there. You also may have noticed that here at the end, just to reinforce the timeline thinking, I like to say at the end, what happened, right? So we're reminding people we want a story. Tell me about a time when something happened. What happened? Also, in place of tell me about a time, I know some people use language like take me to a moment when, right? That's powerful for some similar reasons. So there's some basic language that might be helpful to you as you invite your teams and your partners to tell you some stories. So let me share with you another idea for finding stories and eliciting stories that you can bring forward. And this is something that I was actually thinking about last week when I was in the Netherlands, when I was in Utrecht, and I was standing up in front of a room of the leaders. And we discussed this idea of how do we find the stories that are relevant to our business. And one of the things I said to him is, how would you tell the story of now? How would you tell the story of now? And what do I mean by that? What I mean is there are stories happening all of the time. We are in a story at this moment. I'm in a story. Something is happening right now, a story that I could tell. You're in a story too. If you're listening to this message, something is happening right now. You're in a story that you could tell. So here's how I would invite people to reflect on the story of now. And that is, there's a moment of presence and awareness, right? We're with the group, we're with the team. And what I tell the group is, give yourself an assignment. You have a homework assignment, which is, you're going to tell the story of this moment to someone later. So already having this assignment has a focusing effect on your attention. It makes you present, right? It helps you step outside of yourself and pay attention to what's happening in the room right now. I'm going to tell the story of this moment to someone later. So how would I do that? How would I frame what is happening right now? What details that are happening in the room do I notice that I would bring to my story? So we're already constructing our story in our heads while we're in the moment. And then next, how would I frame what this story means? So part of telling stories as a leader, and I always share this with my leaders, is, when we're constructing stories we're going to bring forward, there's this important piece where the leader makes a statement. I think this story says something. This story reveals something about who we are and what we care about. And I'm going to say with my words what that is. And so that's part of leadership storytelling, leadership narrative. And so we're in this moment. You're listening to me deliver this. How would you tell this story of what's happening right now? And what do you think it means? Right? When I was in the Netherlands, I started doing this. I started noticing some themes emerging in the room of, how do we manage fear in an innovation process? And I thought, this is interesting. I see some things coming up here. I'm starting to get a sense of how I would tell this story later. Just now, as I'm filming this for this conference, but before we hit record, I was in a dialogue with Artum. And we're in a story. Artum and I were friends, right? And a story is happening while we're collaborating. How would I tell the story of right now? And I started thinking about the power of friendship and how micro stories. Artum and I were already telling stories to each other before we started recording this. And I was noticing how when we tell stories, that the impact that has on our friendship. And then since, Artem is in Moscow and I'm here in the United States, and there's these macro stories happening right now that everybody in the world is hearing about our countries, I'm wondering, what is the role of these micro stories between two human beings in the face of these billion-dollar investments that countries are making, these meta narratives about power, right? So maybe that's one way of telling the story of now that I'm in as I collaborate with Artum. The thing about this is there's no one way to tell a story. If my leaders in Utrecht told the story of that moment, there's a real good chance they would not tell a story about fear and innovation. Or if Artum told a story about us collaborating, he might come up with something totally different than what I did. And I am the narrator of my experience, just as you are the narrator of your experience. And that's part of what makes this beautiful, is this diversity of stories. And what a rich opportunity for us to sit in a circle and take turns telling these stories, and then take turns saying, here's what I think this story means. And as we do this, we're building our capability as sense-making leaders and as collaborative leaders who are inviting our teams into this meaning-making conversation together. The last thing I'll say about this idea of the story of now, the last piece of this, and this piece is very important, is don't forget to actually go tell your story. Right? We've given ourselves this assignment to notice the story we're in. We're being present. We're doing some sense making in the moment. And the thing about the storytelling skill is if you just think about it, about how interesting stories are, and you think about it in your head, it doesn't tend to work very well. Story comes to life in social connections when we're talking to each other. So if you only think about the story of now and you don't actually tell it, you're not going to build your capability. So the last piece of this assignment is to actually bring it forward, right? Because after I'm done here, I'm going to go downstairs. I'm in my home office, right? My wife is in the kitchen and she's going to say, hey, how did the webinar go? And so I'm already thinking, how am I going to tell this story to my wife? And I'm going to tell her. And now I'm building, continuing to build and deepen my capability as a deeply human storytelling leader of values and sense making. So those are a few ideas for you. And I'll pause there. And Artum, I'll invite you to jump back in. I think that you said you might have some questions or some thoughts for me in the time that we have left together. Oh, there you are, my friend. So good to see you. It's more fun to talk to you. I like seeing your smile.
I know. Thank you so much. It's always lovely to hear you. Yeah, it's a great way how you not only show how to tell a story, which you are pro at, but also how you invited the theme of inviting a story. What it got me thinking about is how maybe it is connected to what leaders not tell, but what leaders do. And I just wanted to prompt you in that direction and maybe ask you to share, uh, is there any way a leader can, influence his or her behavior by inviting the story and, etc.
Yeah. So is your question, how do we influence the behavior of the team by inviting stories?
Maybe the team, or maybe by reflecting on these ideas on the story you're about to tell, maybe it helps the leader to change his or her own behavior, maybe some.
Oh, okay, excellent. Yeah, so that's the beauty of this, right? If we are you and I facilitate this process and we stand in front of teams and we get to hear stories, in my case, in industries where I don't work. So I've never worked in banking in the Netherlands. I don't know that world. I don't know that system, right? And especially as a consultant, there's always this intimidating part, at least to me, when I come into a new organization and I think, oh my gosh, this place is complex. Oh, I have to learn their business model. I've got a lot of catching up to do, right? And it's intimidating at first. But when I start hearing the stories, that's when I go, oh, so that's what your challenges are here. Oh, so that's who you are. Oh, now I see what you care about. Now I understand your complicated work. So simply hearing stories, for those of us who are leaders, can't not change you. We are learning when we hear stories. And because of that empathy connection, the scientists talk about the neural coupling, our brains connect. When I hear stories from leaders, financial leaders in the Netherlands, if they're good stories, our brains are connecting, and it's almost like at some level, this story is happening to me, right? And so now I'm learning new behaviors simply by hearing the stories of what it looks like to be a financial innovation leader. And as I said, I'm also noticing some things about the role of fear in that. And I come out of this changed as a leader. I'm different at the end of this, right?
Yeah, exactly right. I love how you frame it, like inviting yourself to listen to the story of others. It's like, getting to know their context and their content. Uh, but you really got me thinking in a slightly different direction. You see, when you said that you are going to tell the story of now later, that for me sounds like an obligation to be present, as you said, in your life right now. And that means that this act of reflecting of the story of now actually gives me more control of how I'm going to act, because I wouldn't like to tell a story of a failed webinar or a failed negotiation or me being a bad father. And that means reflecting on that makes my actions in the now different. So the story is different in the end.
What a wonderful application. I had not thought of it that way, Artem. And yeah, I think you're exactly right. Not only are we noticing the story we're in, where leadership is, we're shaping the story that we're in. So what kind of story do we want this to be? And I want this to be a story of collaboration and a story of caring for one another and a story of creating, right? I don't want this to be a story of fear or of protecting our ideas or of holding back. And you're exactly right. I want this to be a triumphant story of learning. And I think you're exactly right. That affects the kinds of choices you and I make right now. What a brilliant application. That's really lovely. See, this is why I love collaborating with you. I'm learning, right?
Oh, it's mutual. It's always mutual. There is a question that just came up in my mind. In your amazing book, and I'm going to show it actually, because it's one of the rare ones translated into Russian.
All right.
Yeah. It's actually, did you know that it's in Russian, it's called The 9 Techniques of Storytelling, not the Circle of 9 Muses. So what my question is actually about the story part, not the telling. So
Okay.
in your book, there are a lot of practices where teams are actually, invited to see a bigger story they're in, just like you described. Maybe you could share with us a couple of examples from your recent projects where a leader, with your help or just by themselves, helped the team, invited them to see the bigger story.
Hmm. Hmm. Yes. So seeing the bigger story in my work is a co-creative act, and the bigger story emerges from these micro stories, from these individual stories. And in fact, maybe it's not intuitive, but when I work with groups, I'll even tell them, let's avoid the big story for now, right? Because I work with smart leaders who are working on really complicated projects. They want to tell the story of, well, let me tell you about my client. It's a 3 billion euro healthcare organization, and they have 7 strategic challenges in the marketplace. And they start telling this high level case study, right? And it's boring. Nobody wants to hear it. And so I'm constantly encouraging them, no, go small, get smaller. Bring me into a specific moment, right? Tell me about a time. Give me a person, give me some, a protagonist with skin on them. Humanize this message. And so what we do is we tell these small individual stories, and it takes leaders a little while to get comfortable with that. They're not used to that. They want to tell the big complicated case study. But when they tell a story about a tough conversation I had with my client where I had to confront him, because this is who we are at our organization. We're not going to stand up for these kinds of toxic behaviors. And so I challenged my client, and it didn't go well at first, but here's what happened at the end, right? We tell these smaller human stories. And then what we do is we have the meaning-making conversation and say, what did you hear in that story? And now the rest of the group is saying, oh, that story says so much about who we are, right? So the paradox here is we move towards these very small stories, and then we extrapolate that out and say, this says something about who we are. And now we tell a lot of these stories, and kind of like scenes in a movie, right? Star Wars is 2 hours long. I don't want to tell the whole Star Wars. I'd rather tell a single scene. It's made up of these scenes. We start with Luke Skywalker on a desert planet of Tatooine where he's bored and he wants adventure and he wants to be challenger, right? These individual scenes. And as we tell these, they start unfolding into this larger narrative. And now we get to invite the team. What did you hear in that narrative? So there is this kind of tension between the macro big story and the individual smaller stories that we tell. Did that help?
Awesome. Yeah. I like how you focus on both of them, but emphasize the importance of the microstory. And to continue on from that, here's a quick question, if I may, of course. Can you share with me a time when you were really happy to see how the team heard a small story and it changed something in the room and there, like made them realize something new, and you are witnessing it?
I might need a few moments on this one. So a team heard a story and there was a transformation that happened. I was with a group in Paris, and this was a global organization, and a lot of the senior leaders had come together to hear how their up and coming rising leaders were, building their leadership skills. And so, as a lot of European and American leaders, one of the women who stepped up to tell her story was an Indian woman. She was from Bangalore, India, and she was nervous. She stood like this, and she kind of looked down at her feet because she's talking to this room full of men, and India is a very caste-driven culture. But she told this story about the manufacturing facility that she and others managed in India. And everybody knew a few years earlier that the facility had closed because of SARS. Remember SARS? This was before COVID, right? So everybody knew that because they had seen it on the financial sheets and the financial cost. But no one had ever heard this part of the story. And she told the story of how she had to live in the manufacturing facility. They didn't want to go home and infect their families, and how they were ostracized from their community, and how there was fear in the community. And so it's this story of bravery and courage and dignity, of them taking a stand of leadership to keep this manufacturing facility afloat. And all of these senior leaders had never heard this part of the story. And some of them, I saw them like wiping their eyes a little bit like this, right? And it was a moment that changed how they perceived leadership in India. And I kind of had a feeling the story would travel afterwards, and it did. The company ended up making new investment in the Bangalore facility. They're like, let us tell you about this team of leadership that we have in India, right? So there was a moment where they knew the financial story. They did not know the human story, and the human story changed everything. So there's one example that comes to mind.
Oh, I absolutely love it. And how
You scared me
you
for a moment there when you said, think of a story. At first, I was like, ugh, oh gosh. And I see my participants do this all the time. So you gave me some empathy for the fear that comes when someone says, think of a story, right?
Yeah, I was like, I know this face, and I loved what you did there. It was taking the moment, collecting yourself, and then just launching into the memory and then back out. And
Yeah.
this is an incredible moment. I guess you witnessed it like thousands of times in your programs. I just wanted to follow up. So this was a very tense moment, both for the leaders and for this woman. And I always see this in groups with different power levels when a human story, especially, might come forward, but people are blocking themselves in. So maybe can you give us a couple of clues as a facilitator, as a story circle holder? How can we make this space more fitting for this invitation to share a story so that our participants can, well, use the prompts and maybe set something up?
So the first thing I'll say is what this Indian woman did was, it was not spontaneous. She didn't just decide in the moment. We planned for this moment. And this was intentional. So we'd been together the day before, and this program, the skill building program I do is called the Storytelling Leader, where we strategically find the story assets that we can connect to the work that we care about, and then we get very clear on what story am I telling and why am I telling this. So none of that what happened was an accident. And we even talked in advance about her fear of this. Oh, I hope it's okay for me to tell a personal story like this. Oh, I hope they don't judge me. Oh, I hope they don't think this is weird. Oh, I hope I'm not revealing too much. Oh, I hope they don't use this against me somehow, right? So whenever we use this language, that story, people have these fears, right? Because story language opens us up. We reveal more of who we are when we're telling stories. So one is being ready for that as the storyteller. Then with the group, with the leaders who came in, honestly, we didn't do a whole lot of prep. We did say that we have been having this conversation about what does it look like to show up with more of our humanity as leaders. And that when we use this language, that story, when we bring in narrative, that it creates a different kind of connection. So I remember saying to the team, pay attention to yourselves. What do you notice about your responses as you're about to hear these messages? And we can talk about that. So I did only the lightest amount of framing at the beginning to say, this is going to sound different from other presentations that you typically hear, right? We don't have an Excel spreadsheet that we're going to project up on the wall. We're not going to stare at numbers for an hour. We're going to connect in a different way. Pay attention to that, and we can talk about that afterwards. So that was really the setup, and it was a thing of beauty.
Oh, I love it. I was aiming for an advice on, how to facilitate it and, make the space more comfortable for the tellers. But what you did give us there was an advice on how to prepare somebody who is pre-prepared to share a story, which is also valuable. Thank you so much.
Well, the thing I always tell people is, the work I do is not when people hear the word storytelling, one thing people don't like is they think it's a performance, or they think they have to be an actor and change their voice. And I tell people, I don't do presentation skills. I don't teach you how to be a better public speaker. Some people do that, and that's a good thing. Some people in their development plan, that's what they need. That's just not what I do. What I do is accessing your natural voice. When you do this right, you shouldn't sound like a professional actor. You should sound like you, but a more effective and amplified version of you. And so that's what this woman did. I told her, just talk, just tell us what happened. And afterwards I checked in with her and I said, are you okay with that? Did you feel okay? And like, she was smiling really big, and she's like, I could feel my power as a leader as I did that. And I said, everybody in the room felt your power as a leader, right? And so it's this beautiful moment.
Awesome.
It is awesome.
Yeah, this is so exciting to witness it, and it really happens a lot when you share stories and amplify them. But what I've seen over the years, and I don't want it to sound posh, like over the years. It's like not in that
You've been
sense.
doing this for a while.
Yeah, well, yeah, quite some time. But what I saw is that when somebody else comes, like yourself, and hosts a story circle, it always feels like, yeah, well, there is a shaman in our tribe who has come from afar, and he brings his wisdom, and now we can, share stories in this not typical Excel spreadsheet field type of conversation.
Right.
But then when you leave, it's like there is this hole that stays, and I know that teams continue to share stories, but maybe you could give us an advice on how to leave this place for them, so this practice, this light, stays with them. Maybe any advice on how to host it inside, or that kind of thing.
Yeah. So since my work is organizational and leadership, and we're telling stories because we want to in some way advance the mission of the organization, or we want to move our work forward, I put an emphasis on connecting this skill to the work that you're doing now. And there is this principle of adult learning theory, which is that adults are motivated to learn something if they can see an immediate application. If I can see that this is going to get me what I want, because I take busy leaders and we spend 8 hours together. You know, their emails are piling up and there's emergencies and you know, I'm taking a full day. And the reason we're doing it is they're saying, all right, I think this is going to make a difference in the work that I'm doing. And so often, you know, at the end of the afternoon, one exercise I like to do is we put everybody into teams and I tell them, all right, you're going to deliver a presentation about the work you're doing right now. And it's going to sound different from other presentations that you normally give and hear around here because it's going to be story driven. It's almost going to sound a little bit like a TED Talk. And so we use all of these skills and techniques we've been practicing all day. And then in the afternoon, they deliver these presentations to each other. And usually it's about strategy, or it's about the new project, or the new offering, or the new feature, or the sales message that they're bringing forward to win the new contract, or it's the strategy and transformation message that they're bringing through the organization. And they deliver this, and then at the end they go, oh my gosh, that felt, first of all, that felt and sounded totally different from what we normally do. And second, oh my gosh, we have to leave this room. We have to go deliver this message now. They're like seeing the power of this. So that, you know, that's a long answer to your question. How do we make it stick? Connect it to the work that they care about and give them a chance to practice that. And I find that now it's not just a nice thing that we do because it feels good. I mean, it does feel good. It is fun. But now we see how it's going to get us what we care about in this work. And I find that there's more adoption that way. And then, of course, as part of my work, you know, even beyond the skill building, there are ways that we can do continual coaching, internal certification, mastermind groups. There are lots of ways to keep people immersed in this conversation so we can keep practicing the skill.
That's perfect. I like how the main tool is not setting up a room, but instead, you know, focusing on how do you apply it. It's a real interesting concept. And what I've seen in the corporate world is that people don't feel how like a story is connected to what they do. It's like the bridge is still absent between story and results, and we're, you know, steadily building it. So yeah, I hope the bridges keep on building. And David, thank you so much. It's been such a huge pleasure to see you again and to record this for our conference. I hope everything goes down well, and we will be watching it in May. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. It's such a pleasure.
You make it easy. I feel like we're sitting at that table again in Moscow having lunch. So I love being in dialogue, presenting and speechifying. Yeah, I can do that, but collaborating with friends, I have learned some things today working with you. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And that was David Hutchens for the Stories Without Borders conference. I hope you enjoyed this talk, and we will surely pass your thoughts to David. There are some links in the comments where you can reach him and connect also with every speaker of this event. Likewise, there will be links for connection. And we are moving forward. We have one more speaker for this first half of the first day.